Thank you so much for being here and for taking the time out of your nights to come out to this evening's edition of the Berkeley Forum. As a quick little introduction, the Berkeley Forum is a nonpartisan student-run organization that hosts talks, debates, and panels for the Berkeley campus and community. And everything you see here, from student photography to marketing to student moderating, is entirely student-run. And we could not put on these events without the support of our hardworking and very talented student staff. Before I begin, I would just like to remind people to please close all laptops and silence all cell phones, and to please give the speakers the attention that they are due. And tonight is a very exciting event because we will be hosting a debate on the reparations for slavery. The resolution is as follows: the U.S. government should pay reparations to African Americans impacted by slavery. And the format of this event will be as follows. I am also fortunate enough to be a moderator for this evening, and I will introduce each of our speakers one by one, and they will present a brief 3-minute overview of their position. Following this, we will move into the moderated cross-examination stage. Then we will move into audience question and answer, and then the closing statements of our wonderful speakers. On the pro, we have Professor Roy Brooks and Professor Marjolin Armstrong. Marjolin Armstrong, thank you. And on the con, we have Coleman Hughes and Professor Robert Settler. So these are our lovely speakers for tonight. So our first speaker for tonight, Professor Roy Brooks, is on the pro side and will be speaking in favor of reparations. Professor Roy Brooks served as the senior editor of the Yale Law Journal, clerked for the Honorable Clifford Scott Green of the U.S. District Court in Philadelphia, and practiced corporate law with Cravath, Swain, and Moore in New York City. He joined the University of San Diego School of Law faculty in 1979. He teaches and writes in the areas of legal and critical theory, civil procedure, civil rights, employment discrimination, and international human rights, and his works include Atonement and Forgiveness, A New Model for Black Reparations, and Sorry Isn't Enough, the controversy over apologies and reparations for human injustice. So without further ado, Professor Brooks.
Thank you. Resolved, the United States government should pay reparations to African Americans impacted by slavery. Reparations, let's be clear in terms of what we mean by reparations. Here we are talking about the government, the United States government, attempting to redress two of the worst atrocities ever present on American soil. That is to say, slavery and Jim Crow. And I'm going to refer to both of them as slave redress. That's the general concept of reparations. However, the question presented sort of begs two questions that I would like to address in the time allotted to me. The first question is, what do we mean in terms of an approach to reparations? How do we approach it? And that's an important question because there are two major approaches to reparations: the tort model and the atonement model. The tort model has been the received tradition for slave redress since at least the time that I began to research, write, and speak on the subject back in the 1990s. Its approach to slavery, to slave redress, is backward-looking, it is victim-focused, and it is compensatory. Sometimes it seeks a punitive justice as opposed to compensatory justice. The main thrust of the tort model is to provide a paycheck to each descendant of the enslaved. Now, I don't have time to go into the pros and cons of this. I'm just sort of laying it out for you. But in Atonement and Forgiveness, around page 138 or so, I lay out the deficiencies of the atonement model, of the tort model. So obviously, I am not in favor of the tort model. I am in favor of the atonement model. I think that that is simply a superior approach to slave redress. Now, unlike the tort model, the atonement model is forward-looking. It is perpetrator focused, and it seeks restorative justice. So in other words, the atonement model imbibes this post-Holocaust spirit or vision of heightened morality, of egalitarianism, of identity between the victim and the perpetrator of the atrocity, and restorative justice. There are three elements to the atonement model. It's the perpetrator's apology, the perpetrator's reparations, and then the victim's forgiveness. And the second question that I think we need to look at in our attempt to resolve the question presented is the form of reparations. And there are many forms of reparation, limited only by the human imagination. But generally speaking, there are, the reparations can be compensatory in that they are directed toward the victims or the victim's descendants individually, or it could be rehabilitative in that they are directed toward the victim's community. In addition, compensatory and rehabilitative reparations can be monetary or in kind. So a paycheck, vouchers, scholarships, job training programs, special admissions, museums, memorials, and the list goes on. The final point that I want to make is that the tort model is usually presented as a form of compensatory reparations, whereas the atonement model pursues rehabilitative reparations. And I think that is important because what an atonement reparation is, again, the focus is on the perpetrator, not the victim. What it attempts to do is designed to make the rhetoric of apology, to turn the rhetoric of apology into a meaningful material reality. That is to say, to make the apology believable. I'm told that I've reached my limit, so I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor. Our first comm speaker for the evening will be Mr. Coleman Hughes, who's joining us by Skype. Mr. Coleman Hughes is a student at Columbia University majoring in philosophy. He's a writer and opinion columnist on issues related to race and racism at Colette Online magazine. He's also contributed to publications including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Heterodox Academy blog. On June 19th of 2019, Hughes testified before Congress in a House Judiciary Subcommittee hearing on reparations for slavery, arguing against the campaign. So, Mr. Hughes?
Thank you so much for having me. First, I just want to apologize for this somewhat bizarre setup. I feel somewhat like the Wizard of Oz. But the first thing I want to say is that this is not a referendum about whether slavery was an atrocious institution with a long legacy. I think many times when people say, I am for reparations, what they mean is, I understand that slavery was a massive part of this country's history. And so I want to just wholeheartedly agree with that and say nothing in my opposition is meant to minimize that history or its legacy. So first, I support reparations paid to people directly impacted by Jim Crow, for example, like my grandfather. But we should understand that the average black person in America now is 33 years old. And though there's certainly precedent for reparations paid to direct victims, there's no precedent for reparations paid to someone like me who is at this point several generations removed from the crime, if we're talking about a check, for example. And obviously many people want reparations to be more than a check. They want it to be something like criminal justice reform or universal health care or fill in the blank. And many of these are policies I think are very much important. And it's precisely for that reason that I think it's dangerous to frame them as reparations, because that instantly makes them less feasible. For example, criminal justice reform. We passed the First Step Act a year ago, which reduced mandatory minimums and was a first step to sort of making the criminal justice system, at least the federal one, less punitive. I'm for that. I think it would have been much harder to pass if we had called it the Prison Reparations Act, for example. And that's true of any policy you could think of that you might want to put in the reparations bucket. And finally, I want to say, the goal is for slavery to feel like a closed wound for Americans. Right now, it feels like an open wound for many Black people, and the question is how we're going to get it to feel like a closed wound. And I think many people imagine that a national apology or reparations, once it's fully realized, will give them a sense of closure. But I think ultimately, politics is not a means of getting closure on an issue such as this one, and I think it's a false hope. So with that said, I'll cede my time.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. Our second pro speaker for the night will be Professor Marjolyn Armstrong. Professor Armstrong joined the Santa Clara University School of Law faculty in 1987 and serves on the boards of several community organizations. She's well published in the areas of housing, racial discrimination, comparative, and constitutional law. Prior to joining the law faculty at Santa Clara, Armstrong practiced public employment law, served as a staff attorney with the Legal Aid Society of Alameda County, and directed the academic support program at the Berkeley School of Law. While she attended University of California, Berkeley, she served as associate editor of the Ecology Law Quarterly. So without further ado, Professor Armstrong.
And I too want to join in thanking you for this invitation. Reparations is often defined so broadly or left undefined that it's an easy target to shoot down. But reparations for slavery as an abstract concept does present difficulties. However, if reparations are defined with more specificity regarding the actions that justify them, and if it's possible to identify who would be eligible to be compensated for harm using precise standards of eligibility, we can make a strong case for reparations. And first of all, reparations should not be based solely on slavery. Rather, they should attempt to mitigate the harm done through government actions at federal, state, and local levels to impose upon African Americans the badges and incidents of slavery after the legal elimination of slavery. Reparations should also be used to compensate African Americans who have suffered the most from government policies that impose those badges and incidents of slavery. And there are more and more ways of specifically identifying such people. And finally, programs of reparations should use a number of different tools. Some can be monetary. I agree that in-kind approaches should be used to remedy wrongs that continue to impose material deprivations rooted in race-based discriminations. So the phrase badges and incidents of slavery comes from or was used prominently in a Supreme Court case that wasn't particularly favorable towards legislation involving discrimination. It was legislation that was attempting to address the black codes that many states had enforced and tried to replicate slavery with after the end of the Civil War. While there were many programs by the federal, state, and local governments that effectively tried to replicate the kinds of conditions that existed in slavery. And this went on, this occurred well into the 20th century, and there are still people who suffer from those types of actions. One area that's of particular interest to me is housing. In the government-sponsored housing boom of the 50s and 60s, there were restrictive covenants that were required by the federal government. Well, restrictive covenants are similar to some of the conditions of slavery. I'll explain further. Thank you.
Thank you. Last but certainly not least, our second con speaker for the evening will be Professor Robert Sedler. Robert Sedler is the Distinguished Professor of Law at Wayne State University in Detroit. He has litigated a large number of civil rights cases in Michigan, Kentucky, and elsewhere, mostly as a volunteer attorney for the ACLU. In Michigan, he successfully litigated a case that ended discrimination against African American children in adoption and foster care. Professor Sedler has been a strong advocate for affirmative action. Going back to 2000, Professor Sedler has also written and spoken extensively in opposition to reparations for slavery. He maintains that demands for reparations are politically unpopular and erode support of many white Americans for affirmative action and other important issues of racial discrimination and racial inequality. Professor Sedler?
Thank you. You summed up my talk. I really was anxious to come out here. I got up in Detroit at about 1 o'clock Pacific time in order to be here. This is going to be a very interesting forum. As you can see, I'm old and I'm white. I've done an awful lot of civil rights litigation. I've been a strong advocate for racial equality, but I'm white. My ancestors were not slaves. I have not suffered racial discrimination. You all hear me? As have many people of color in the past, and unfortunately to some extent today. So, my perspective on reparations, like my perspective on all issues of racial equality, is a white perspective. But that perspective is a very important one. Whites make up about 77% of the population. 91 of the 100 senators are white. 70% of the representatives in the House are non-Hispanic and white. All the majorities in all the legislatures are white. African Americans make up about 14% of the population. Now those are the political realities. Every advance in civil rights, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Fair Housing Act of 1968, anti-discrimination laws in state legislatures, all had to have substantial white support. The problem with the concept of reparations, howsoever you define it, is it is a non-starter for whites. You can call it atonement, you can call it compensation, you can define it in all the ways that you want to define it. But it's going to be perceived of as giving $22,000. That was the amount of reparations that we paid the Japanese Americans who had been interned to Oprah Winfrey. It diverts attention from the crucial issues of racial equality, Black Lives Matter, disproportionate racial poverty, underrepresentation in the American economic and political system, overrepresentation in American prisons. Whites will support claims for racial equality when there is a perceived sense of injustice. One of the facets, many facets of the greatness of Martin Luther King was that he was able to convey to whites a sense of injustice about racism and discrimination and segregation. Claims for reparations do not touch a sense of injustice. It is a bad idea politically. It diverts attention from important issues of racial equality. I said this 20 years ago. I'm 20 years older. Nothing has changed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers for your addresses. We'll now be moving into the cross-examination stage of the debate, where I'll be asking questions to all of our speakers, and we will alternate between starting with the pro and the con sides as they provide their answers. So to start off, I think it's important to set up some definitions to frame the debate. Over the course of American history, the black population has continued to evolve through slavery, the civil rights period, and into the modern era with increased immigration from African nations. Given this context and the influx of African immigrants from other countries, how, if at all, should the government evaluate who would be the relevant beneficiaries or people to be considered in any program for racial justice? And we can start with Professor Brooks.
Yeah, well, you know, in a sense, that's a non-issue if you are looking at the atonement model, because your focus, reparations there, the atonement reparations are community building reparations, and so you're not really focused on individuals per se, you're focused on communities, okay? But if you are going through the tort model where there is a focus on the individual, then there are easy ways of dealing with this, because what you want to do is make sure that a descendant of a slave is receiving the reparations. There's all kinds of data out there. There are CDs and libraries that list all of the slaves in a particular area, the slave owners. Professor Henry Louis Gates does a wonderful job of his PBS program of going back and finding the ancestry. So that's not a real issue. The critical question is this: can we accept this in concept? Once we accept the concept, then we work out the minor issues.
No, no matter how you define the concept, all of the slaves are long dead. What we have had in this country is what I've called in my writings the social history of racism. A long history of governmental discrimination, private discrimination, very hard for this generation to understand. People of my generation saw it, lived through it. The consequences of the social history of racism endure. We have to deal with them consequence by consequence. Trying to tie them to reparations for slavery simply is a drain. It is a negative. It is a turnoff. It is really inimical to serious efforts to achieve racial inequality for African Americans and other racial minorities in 21st century America.
In the interest of spreading out opportunities, Professor Armstrong, would you like to go?
Well, actually, I'll refer. That's specific.
Yeah, I mean, by that way of thinking, then we should not have done anything about slavery, because it upset a whole bunch of white people. By that way of thinking, we should not have done anything about Jim Crow, because it upset a whole bunch of white people. Yeah, there are a lot of white people around, but it doesn't mean that you're right. And that's part of the process of talking about this, so that we can get it out there and we can look at the facts. And one thing, President, you're a civil rights attorney, so am I. And the one thing that we know about a civil rights theorist is that we want to be pretty political. What we try to do is to make moral judgments, and then we work like hell to move society in the right direction. That's exactly what Thurgood Marshall did. That's exactly what Martin Luther King did. There wasn't a bunch of white people who agreed with them at the beginning, but over time, when we talked about this, when we get them to reflect on this, then that's called a movement.
Mr. Hughes, do you have anything?
Are we still addressing the practical question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I sort of agree with the other side here in the sense that, I think if we really wanted to do it, we could. And the economist Sandy Darity has done some work on sort of how we would figure out who to count as black for what purposes. I think, if there were enough motivation, we would find a way. So my argument against reparations isn't only pragmatic. I'm not saying we should do it because we wouldn't be able to figure out who's a descendant of a slave and who's not. I think the much deeper question is will this have good consequences for American society at large in 2019? The answer seems to me to clearly be no. And the burden really is, well, it's one of two things. It's either to show that a check with slavery in the memo line to all African Americans is going to be a net good for society. Or if you think reparations is much more than a check, the burden is to show why whatever policies fit your definition of reparations ought to be framed as reparations rather than as policies that Americans deserve by virtue of being Americans, not by virtue of being a descendant of one particular group or another.
Professor Armstrong?
Well, I think that if you define reparations so broadly as every African American is entitled to reparations, you immediately run into the barrier that we've been talking about with respect to practicality. I think that reparations should be more finely tuned, and I also think that not every African American descendant of slaves needs reparations, and therefore there should be some type of determination that's somewhat need-based in terms of deprivations, and I don't think you have to go all the way back to slavery, as I've said repeatedly. There have been so many policies that kept African Americans from participating in the benefits of society recently, as far as time goes, that there are ways to try to address those deprivations, and I'll stop.
Thank you. I'd like to touch on something that both Professor Sedler and Mr. Gibbs brought up, which is the impact that the practice of reparations could have on race relations. According to a Gallup poll from 2018, it found that the view of relations between Black and white Americans to be at their lowest since 2000. How, if at all, would reparations, if instituted, affect the standing of race relations in American society? And we can start off with Professor Sedler.
It's not something that I pay a lot of attention to. Whites think that if you take surveys, oh, there's no discrimination anymore. African Americans see it very differently. My focus has always been on dealing with the problems that exist today as a result of what I've called the social history of racism. The debate about reparations seems to me to be very abstract. What do we do about Black Lives Matter? What do we do about disproportionate prison for African Americans? What do we do about disproportionate racial poverty? There are a lot of things that can be done. If it is approached in terms of we have problems in American society of racial consequences, and we want to do something about those consequences, then that has a much better chance of being accepted. Also, one of the enduring consequences is disproportionate racial poverty. But there are also a lot of poor whites. I was at the University of Kentucky for a number of years, and I saw Appalachia. I can assure you that the conditions in Appalachia, which also trace to government policies in ways, are very bad. So maybe if we put aside the notion of race and say, what can we do to alleviate the condition of poverty, to raise incomes and provide benefits for all low-income people, this will benefit African Americans, it will benefit whites, and it will be acceptable.
Professor Armstrong?
Well, I believe that there are ways of looking at the deprivations that can really be distinguished between things that only African Americans experienced and things that other groups have experienced with respect to poverty. For example, with the racially restrictive covenants that the federal government required in order for people to be able to get government subsidized or government guaranteed loans. Blacks were excluded from this huge program. Well, if there was some program that was aimed at giving people who were not able to take advantage of that the ability to buy houses at the price that they were sold for originally and get that kind of benefit, and this is Richard Rothstein's idea, but the idea of going to a very specific point in time and trying to remedy that with a specific percentage of people who were excluded from being a full recipient of the benefits of the United States.
Mr. Hughes?
Yeah, so the question is, what effect will this have on race relations? I think that's a two-part question. First part, since there are two races involved, obviously we often talk in America as if there are only two races, and immigrants tend to get frustrated by this. But leaving that aside, I have, it will probably come as no surprise that I have many white conservative fans, and one surprising thing that many of them tell me is that they want reparations to happen precisely so that they can finally say, you've been paid, can we stop talking about this racism thing? And I think no doubt that would happen if reparations were paid. I'm not co-signing or advocating that type of perspective. What I'm saying is there would be a sense that now we have sort of lost the right to advocate for problems that uniquely plague Black people once reparations have been paid. And I don't think you can close the door on an obligation to, so like much of my point is that the obligation of citizenship never expires, right? You always own an obligation if the obligation is based on being a citizen. If it's based on being a descendant of an atrocity, once the thing is paid, you wash your hands of the obligation. I don't think that's very healthy on the white side. On the Black side, I think there is a tendency to, to assign something great in importance before it's happened, and then in retrospect to redefine it so that it's not very important. For instance, the election of Barack Obama. If you had asked most Black people in 2007 if we'd ever have a Black president, they would say, hell no. And the reason is because most Black people thought, we weren't ready as a country. There's still too much racism. And then we got Obama for 2 years, for 2 terms. And it wasn't 2 seconds after Obama got elected that every op-ed columnist and their mother was writing a column about how actually this doesn't mean all that much, and wait a minute. And I think the same thing would happen with reparations. Before it happens, it would seem extremely important. After it happens, we would be quick to define it down to insignificance. And I think the marriage of that with the sort of washing our hands of this attitude that you would see among many whites on the right would certainly be toxic for race relations.
Professor Brooks?
We just have a very incorrect understanding of what reparations are. And if you look at around the world at the Holocaust, South Africa, places where reparations and where redress, really we're talking about redress for past atrocities, they have reparations or redress has a very specific purpose, and that is to allow the perpetrator to atone for a particular atrocity. An atrocity is something, a past atrocity, I underscore past, because this is what makes reparations so difficult, because these are atrocities that are beyond current law. They're in the past. There's statute of limitations which prevent any prosecution, what have you. And it's not designed to resolve the entire of a particular problem. The problems that Jews had in Germany, the problems that Blacks have here, the problems that Japanese Americans have in the United States. It's not, it has a very specific purpose. It's designed for the perpetrator to come forward and to show that remorse and to attempt to fix a broken relationship that arises out of the atrocity. Mass incarceration, that's not a reparation, it's not past. It's not, we have current laws that deal with that. With slavery, it's in the past. We don't have laws to deal with that, so that's why it's a moral statement. It's not, this is not a political statement, it's not a judicial statement, it's a moral concept.
In this discussion, one thing that's been brought up a lot is using past structures of reparations policies to dictate what the future of this discourse should look like. In particular, one critique of past reparations to indigenous individuals was that the government didn't directly award compensation to impacted groups, instead putting these funds into corporations and giving groups stock shares. And similar critiques of other past reparations policies exist as well. How, if at all, should the current reparations discourse, whether for advocates or for adversaries of reparations, incorporate previous critiques through history into the debate about reparations policies? And Professor Armstrong, if you want to start out.
I'm a little puzzled in terms of what the specific types of programs in the past are and what they have to say to what is the current debate. Just because the situation we have with respect to African Americans, not that African Americans were the only people who were enslaved, but there was it was hugely in the fabric of the United States. And although maybe 600,000 Africans were brought to what's now the United States, by the time of the Civil War, there were more than 3 million. So this is kind of a homegrown and certainly something that was caused by our structures here, and may be unique in the sense of kind of propagating the number of people who were victimized by slavery. And it's also something that's been a little difficult because of the way that we have ignored members of our families in the United States when members of the family were identified as slaves because of the mother. So I'm not sure how to apply other models here, because in some ways it's unique.
Mr. Hughes?
Yeah, I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, but it's just to what extent should reparations be informed by other examples of it? Yeah, so I think most if not all successful examples of reparations, as has been pointed out, have been for specific atrocities by the specific perpetrators to the specific victims, which is exactly the reason I've opposed paying reparations to all descendants of slaves. Like, I'm not a specific victim, and exactly why I've supported paying it to, for example, the specific victims of Jim Crow, those who were born under it. That makes sense, and that follows precedent. I think, when we think of sort of truth and reconciliation campaigns in the style of sort of South Africa, or those that have materialized in the immediate aftermath of a crime, tend to work because you have the people there looking in the eyes of the people who committed an atrocity and demanding an apology, getting one, and forgiving them in real time. And that, there's a sort of connection there that is allowed by the fact that the actual people are present, and that's obviously not true of American slavery. And as time goes on, it's less and less true of Jim Crow. But the example that I would point to that people don't think about, but that I worry about, is Korea and Japan in terms of Japanese war crimes against Korea during World War II. Japanese prime ministers have apologized for that literally several dozen times, atrocious, and still, Koreans don't feel they've apologized enough, and I can understand that perspective from an emotional level. But does that suggest that, again, here people are looking to politics for a kind of emotional closure that politics can't provide?
Professor Brooks?
The reason that the comfort women are not satisfied with the apologies from the Japanese prime ministers is because it hasn't come from the people, the Diet. The Diet refuses to apologize. They actually mock the comfort women. That's the problem here. I think your question is very good, because it is something in 2000, I participated in a conference in Copenhagen, and we talked about this very thing. We're trying to frame reparations going forward, and we do learn from our past mistakes. We know that, for example, in South Africa, they gave there were compensatory monetary reparations, and some of the lawyers there said, well, yeah, they got money, but a year later they were poor again. So that's one of the reasons why I, sort of take that into consideration in my formulation of reparations and say I'm not in favor of compensatory reparations. I think that they have to be rehabilitative. And there are reparation models around the world where survivors have received reparations. So you don't have to be a direct victim, but I'm not conceding that African Americans today are not victims. I'm saying that using the language that people use, you don't have to be a direct victim. And just think about the concept. If that were the case, then all the perpetrator would have to do would wipe out all the victims. Would not have to apologize, and not have to even consider reparations. Just wipe out all the victims. So that's kind of a non-starter, that thought.
Professor Sedler?
Well, one of the problems that has emerged from this debate and all the discussions about reparations is nobody defines what they mean by reparations. This could be reparations, that could be reparations. Use the word, the concept of reparations. It means $22,000 for Oprah Winfrey. And perpetrators. Am I a perpetrator? My ancestors didn't come here till after 1900, partly to escape anti-Semitism in Russia. Are the people in Appalachia perpetrators? Who are the perpetrators? The slaves are long dead, so are the slave owners. Who can come forth and say, I am guilty? And while we debate all of this, we just divert attention, we erode support for crucial issues of racial equality that affect the day-to-day lives of many African Americans and other racial minorities.
Thank you all so much for answering my question. In the interest of time, we'll be moving on to the audience. If you are able, please raise your hand. Otherwise, just signal some interest in asking a question. Since we are Skyping a speaker in, I'd ask that you can speak up, please, just so everyone is audible. So if you have a question for the speakers, fire away. Yes.
So in 2016, Georgetown University instituted a formal apology for its role in reinforcing the slave trade and named some of its buildings on campus after the recognized contributions of enslaved people. So what role can things like verbal apologies and naming a building after victims and things like that play in the larger conversation about that?
It can only be a partial response. I mean, with respect to Georgetown, the Jesuits who founded Georgetown actually owned slaves, and they actually separated slave families by selling them. And one of the things that Georgetown proposed doing was to create scholarships for actual descendants of the people who had been enslaved. And now that it's easier to find the actual relations of people who specifically suffered under slavery, that can be a part of what reparations means. But memorials and changing the names of buildings really doesn't do enough, except it's a start in terms of recognizing that a wrong was done, which has to be the start of any program of reparations.
Mr. Gibbs?
So the question is, what role do verbal apologies have to play? I think many people believe them to be more powerful than they are, and I think they're the perfect. Well, that may not be true in the abstract, but in this particular context of American slavery and reparations to Black people. So, for example, the U.S. Senate issued a formal apology for the lynching of African Americans in 2004, The Senate and the House of Representatives issued formal apologies for slavery and Jim Crow in 2008 and 2009, and almost nobody knows or cares about this. But the point being, and it goes back to my point about the election of Barack Obama. Something that you think is a huge deal before you have it, in retrospect, you can define down to complete insignificance, and that's happened with every serious attempt to recognize the enormity of the crime of slavery, and it's likely to happen with reparations as well.
The concept of reparations is pretty well defined by the scholars who've been working on this for decades. And an apology, for example, that is important. I wouldn't accept slave redress unless there was an apology first and foremost. The comfort women of Japan, they insisted on an apology. They said, I don't want the money unless there's going to be an apology because it's about dignity and honor. That's what it's about. And an apology is important. Again, as I said, the scholars, we sort of work these things out. All the issues, I mean, they're sort of out there, and they've been discussed and dissected by scholars. And the so-called apology that the joint resolution by the Congress in 2006, that was a joke. It doesn't meet the requirements of an apology. Apology there were 4 elements of an apology, which I won't go into here, but it didn't have 2 of them. There was an apology resolution in 1996 that the United States Congress passed, apologizing to the Native Hawaiians for the forceful overthrow of their government 100 years prior to that. An apology is an important, but you determine the sincerity of an apology by the weight of the reparations. If the reparations are puny, then the apology is not sincere. An apology, though, is absolutely essential to redress.
Professor Sedler?
Who apologizes? In one sense, from a constitutional standpoint, the 13th Amendment apologizes for slavery by banning it forever in the United States. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment apologizes by making all the newly emancipated slave citizens. There's one thing that's going through my mind. Let's assume that Kamala Harris wins the Democratic nomination for president. I don't think she will. It's interesting that African American voters don't seem to be very supportive of African American candidates. That's another issue. But she wins the nomination, and you are our campaign manager. Would you advise her to lead up front? I will apologize for slavery. I will make sure that we pay reparations for slavery. Think about that if you were her campaign manager, or if you were the campaign manager of anybody who might get the Democratic nomination. If you wouldn't do that, then you're saying that whites are opposed to it, African Americans are not terribly in favor of it. Why don't we deal with the real problems of racial inequality in the United States today instead of this ephemeral notion of reparations?
Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a series of questions, but I first want to respond to what was just said. I have a problem with the phrase African Americans and then referencing whites. I think by saying African American, you're saying, what is the standard of American? It's white people, but you could just call us black people. Also, I think Kamala Harris, and please fact check me if I'm wrong, but she's Indian, and talking about slavery might be a little bit difficult there. And then I just have a very huge concern about talking about slaves turning into citizens. Why not talk about free people who were enslaved and then given their rights back? But more importantly, I want to talk about how do we establish equity and reparations for the black people who are here in Berkeley. Over time, especially in West Berkeley, more and more black people are being pushed out of the city with high rises and rents. How can we help only myself, but other Black community members be invested in our community again, including Black businesses and protecting open space, parks, and as refuge for Black Americans.
That's not a reparation. Those are real problems, but they can be dealt with current civil rights laws, the Fair Housing Act, local statute. California has a whole lot of really great civil rights and housing, employment, all across the board. And I think we have to be very careful about what we mean when we talk reparations. I mean, it's out there. There was a book review that I did for the University of Chicago about last week. And I said, no, don't publish this thing. The author wanted to bring reparations to deal with mass incarceration. That's not a past atrocity. The reparations deal with past atrocities, and the onus falls upon the perpetrator to atone. And it's not a political, it's not a judicial mandate, it's a moral issue. That's the question, it's moral. And in our closing statements, I will read something from a very important person in the history of reparations, which sort of drives home this point.
Mr. Hughes?
I mean, he made a lot of different points. I mean, one, I don't think I can respond to all of them, but I think Kamala Harris is half Indian, half Jamaican, and presumably her half Jamaican side is descended from Jamaican slavery. That's apropos of nothing, but, and yeah, I'm not sure exactly what else to respond to there.
Professor Armstrong?
Well, again, there's certainly some of the elements that have held over from slavery, the badges and incidents of slavery play out in terms of issues like mass incarceration, the whole program of the war on drugs really has a very close tie to slavery if you look at the Michelle Alexander book, The New Jim Crow, which said Jim Crow was a replacement for slavery. Mass incarceration is a way of depriving rights the way that Jim Crow was. And so I wouldn't dismiss this conversation as having nothing to say with respect to people who are suffering right now. But I understand that those immediate problems have to be addressed, and they have to be addressed structurally. And to go into that, well, we have to have another debate about capitalism.
Professor Sedler?
Let me make another point. And again, if I'm being pragmatic and being political, you're absolutely right. This is one of the things that I've learned many, many years dealing with issues of equality. You can sometimes do some things in the courts. We have just achieved same marriage for same-sex couples, one of our cases from Michigan that I was involved with. We have achieved certain degrees of racial equality, but basically it takes legislative action. It's got to be pragmatic. And I want to use an example. I've followed some of the hearing they had in Congress on this. And one of their proposals was that we give free tuition to at least some African Americans. Now that's unconstitutional. Supreme Court has said the government can't use race to overcome societal discrimination. But suppose we remove the racial equation. Suppose we're going to give free tuition to all people below a certain income level. That will disproportionately benefit African Americans and Hispanics because they are disproportionately poor in comparison to whites. But it will also benefit a lot of whites, and because it benefits everybody coming into that category, capitalist or not, it's going to get public support. So again, I think it is much more important to deal with the current real problems of American society than engage in a largely theoretical debate about reparations for slavery and its aftermath.
Any other questions? Yes.
My question's mostly, I think, for Professor Sedler. First of all, thank you for your work on behalf of civil rights. I really want to put that up front. It sounds like you've done a great deal to promote civil rights, and you're in a good position as the only white person on the stage. But I'm so disturbed to hear you say essentially that because it's an unpopular idea and it doesn't get any political traction, that it's not something to pursue, and then just fold your hands, and that's all. Because as Professor Brooks said, this is a moral issue. This is a moral issue for our country, and you're absolutely right. You didn't have any slaves, I didn't have any slaves, there aren't any people who are alive today that were slaves, but everyone in this room every day benefits from the slavery that happened in this country. Our country is the mega superpower that it is because it was built on the backs of slaves. And every benefit that we enjoy every day is because of slavery. And I'm basically just quoting from something that I read at the African American History Museum, but every bite of food that you put in your mouth, you are benefiting from slavery. And so, I mean, I don't stand to gain from reparations, but I want to feel good about being an American. And I can't feel good about being an American if I just say, well, reparations are impractical and the white people don't like it, and just fold my hands. So what other idea do you have? Because I think we're capable. These are students at UC Berkeley. I was one 100 years ago. I think we're capable of holding more than one idea at one time. Yes, mass incarceration is a problem. Yes, redlining is a problem. But we can think about reparation too. That's how I feel, and I would like to know if you've been asking yourself, if no to reparation, what other moral responses to the atrocity of slavery would you like to consider?
Again, it's very easy to say taking a moral stance. It's a lot harder to take a pragmatic stance. It's a lot harder to litigate issues of equality before largely unsympathetic courts. It's pretty hard to try to get legislation through. And you can talk about morality, you can talk about white privilege. It's going to be pretty hard to tell the folks in Appalachia that somehow you've been the that you've been beneficiaries of white privilege. It's hard sell. But it's fine to debate these type of things. I'm simply pointing out the pragmatic difficulty with it. And the answer is, it is a drag. Talking about reparations for slavery just diverts attention from the real issues of racial inequality that exist in American society today. It may make people feel good to talk about morality and the evils of slavery, and that somehow all white people have benefited from slavery, a pretty difficult thing to demonstrate empirically. But again, we perhaps have different concerns. I talked about this 20 years ago. I said the same thing now. And it's just going to go away. The House talked about having some hearings. There's been no action in the House. The Senate is not going to act. I live in a city, middle-class city, Southfield, Michigan. It's about 70% African American. It's a pretty affluent, middle-class city. None of the members of council who are African American, the mayor is one, they don't talk about reparations. That's just not a matter of interest. I don't see the black ministers in Detroit or anywhere else who have been a very cogent political force talking about reparations. And so I simply consider it to be an issue that has no practical importance, and that it's not going to happen. And the debate over reparations simply diverts attention from the real issues of inequality in American society.
Professor Brooks, you look like you.
Yeah, I should say this, that in 1995, when a publisher approached me to do a book on reparations, I said, no, it's a silly notion. Didn't think it was worth it. I said, it's a crazy notion. And then he sent me a plane ticket and asked me if I would meet a comfort woman. I said, a what? Who that was, a comfort woman from Japan. And I flew to Chicago, sat in the lobby with her interpreter, and I said, stop interpreting, I get it. So what I'm trying to say is that moral understanding, education, that's preparatory to political action. You can't go out and do something politically unless you are properly prepared for it and morally. And I tell my students that we're in law school, but I want you to make this a better society. And I tell them when I was at Yale Law School, there was a student behind me who did an independent study because she felt that if some old guy puts his hand on my knee in an interview, there ought to be a law against that. And she wrote it up, and it became a book on sexual harassment, Catherine McKinnon. And this is what we do. If you're too young to give up, you haven't lived long enough, you're too young, you got to think about these moral issues and think beyond what is today practical. If you don't do that, then you sort of give up your youth.
Mr. Hughes?
Yeah, I mean, on the topic of sort of women's rights for a moment, one thing I've noticed about the difference between how we talk about racial inequality and how we talk about improving lives for women, members of the LGBT community, etc., is that it's really only with race that our conversation is so past focused. And there are obviously historical reasons for that, but it's worth noticing that when we think about how to make society more fair for women, we don't focus on the past, actually. We really just focus on the present. And it's really possible to have a truly ethical and informed conversation about how to make society more equitable without looking at the past. That should be an option that is on the table, and it's an option that is inevitably more in touch with the issues that we actually face, because much has changed. It's fashionable and important and true to point out that history has a long shadow, but what gets lost is that the present day is very different from history in important ways. New problems arise that we've never seen before, and they require new solutions. And so our conversation has to be focused on the present, in my view.
Professor Armstrong?
Well, when you mention whites in Appalachia, I think, yes, here's a very disadvantaged group, but how many white people in Appalachia would give up being white? Who would want to be black? And I think that goes to this issue of the kind of deep-seated white supremacy that was at the core of slavery, and that was at the core of Jim Crow, and that still is something that some people cling on to, and we've seen it very much in the political sphere that we live in today. So, I don't think we should fool ourselves and say it's not a thing, and it's not something that is very powerful. That is the idea of a white identity. Although people complain that they're castigated if they say something about it, it's still a reality in terms of the way that we live in the United States.
Thank you, Professor Armstrong, and thank you all so much for answering the audience's questions. Before we get into the speaker's closing statements, we have a fun little poll for you all. It's tinyurl.com/reparations debate. So if you all feel comfortable enough to vote on your feelings about this issue, I really recommend voting. And it's also on the Facebook page for this event as well. And if any of you have other questions, as the speakers could stay around for a little bit, answer anything that you all have. So with that, I think we'll get into closing statements. So, Professor Brooks, if you'd like to begin.
Sure. The first line in the second book I did on reparations, Atonement and Forgiveness, begins with a syllogism. And the syllogism goes sort of like this. When a government, talking about a government, not individuals, government, that's the perpetrator, government. When a government commits an atrocity against an innocent, underscore innocent people, the government has a moral obligation to apologize for that transgression and to make the apology believable by doing something tangible and redemptive called a reparation. That's to say atonement. The United States government committed an atrocity in the form of slavery, 240 years of slavery, and another 100 years of Jim Crow against an innocent people, African Americans. Ergo, the United States has a moral obligation to atone. And to put a fine point on that, I wanted to read you something, and this was from a very important person in the history of the reparations movement around the world. Speaking for the German government and its people, Konrad Adenauer, the first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, uttered these important words, which captures the heart and soul of the atonement model. Quote, "In our name, unspeakable crimes have been committed and demand compensation and restitution, both moral and material, for the persons and properties of the Jews who have been so seriously harmed." Now, Adenauer came to this view rather late in his tenure, but then here's something that Felix Frankfurter says about that, which I think is important. He says that wisdom too often never comes, and so one ought not to object to it simply because it comes late. And amen to that.
Thank you, Professor Brooks. Mr. Hughes?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying slavery was an enormous, a crime of a degree that is hard to describe. And you know, the logic behind reparations is a logic that says there's something we can do, there's something the US government can do that would effectively, cancel, that would make people feel whole about the topic of reparations. It would close the emotional wound. And I think that, I see no evidence that that's true. I mean, if we talk about what America has done, originally the logic behind affirmative action was a compensatory one. It eventually evolved into the diversity-based rationale, but first it was to repay Black people. As I mentioned, we've had we've had official apologies from the Senate and the House of Representatives. We've had 8 years of a Black president. We dedicate a month of every year to remembering Black history, which of course includes slavery. And what I'm being asked to believe is that there's this one more thing we have to do, which is ill-defined. And once we do that, we're really going to be able to get closure on this issue. And that is something I don't believe is true. I think we're in the year 2019 right now, and we have problems to fix. We have, nearly 2 million people. We incarcerate more people than any nation on earth. We have healthcare costs that are an order of magnitude higher than our peer nations. Those are the problems we have to be focusing on. And it disturbs me, how much energy people have on the topic of reparations relative to those actual issues that are currently happening that we can do something about. And it strikes me that there's a kind of a way in which the legacy of slavery, rather than being described as a very important feature of American history, is being described as all you need to know about American history. And there's a quasi-religious attachment, captured by the metaphor of original sin, that I think is a very dangerous way to look at slavery. And ultimately, we have problems in the present that are real and happening right now that we can fix and ought to focus on.
Professor Armstrong?
Well, I certainly agree that we have problems in the present that are real and need to be focused on. And I would also say look further at why we have some of these problems, and then not just look at the problems, but look at how do we fix those problems, how do we repair a society that has been just rent by racism and by the history and the continuing effects of slavery. And one thing I want to say about reparations is that reparations, in trying to address the lack of the things that people need to prosper, and the things that people really need in order to live their best lives and create their best creations, we have to change this. And here is a way to start by looking at people who have been the descendants of and the recipients of the harms that have come from slavery and the badges of incidents of slavery. And in terms of the benefit, I challenge you to think about how much has been lost. How many geniuses, how many people who could contribute to so many problems were never allowed to because of the badges and incidents of slavery that were imposed upon them. We've lost so much. And if we can try to repair that, we have so much to gain.
Thank you. Professor Stedler?
I was young once too. We've made enormous progress in the 60 years since I've been out of law school. But there's an awful lot to do. And I hope young people, and I wanted to come out here and have an opportunity to engage with them. My law students are sort of different, but don't lose your ideals. Keep trying to make this a better world. If we could only apologize and atone for the horrors of slavery, for the genocide of the American Indian. It didn't begin in Germany. It began on the Cherokee Trail of Tears. For the discrimination against gay and lesbian and LGBT, all LGBT people. Unfortunately, there are a lot of bad things in our history. As a constitutional lawyer, I'd like to be able to try to do what we can to remedy it. More important than atoning is remedying the problems that exist in American society today. Thank you.
To get into just the closing remarks, I think we're ready to display the results of the poll, which should be interesting. And while that's getting set up, I just want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your evenings to come out to this event. This is not the last event in our lineup. We have one more event on December 4th with a cancer researcher by the name of Hasani Jayadilaka. And she will be talking about research on how to slow the spread of cancer. So I would really recommend coming out to that. And thank you once again to all the speakers for taking the time out of their evenings to come out to this. Can we get another round of applause?
Okay, so some technical difficulties there, but let me just refresh this. So as for the responses, we received 19. The first question, did this debate challenge your current views or expose you to new discourse on this topic? Luckily, 90% of you said yes. And then the second question that I'm sure everyone wants to know the answer to, following this debate, have your views on this topic shifted? The plurality, 36.8% said no, they didn't because they're still in favor of reparations. 21% said yes, their views shifted away from reparations. 16% said yes, their views shifted towards reparations. 10% said no, that they're still neutral. And 16% said no, I'm still against reparations. So yeah.
And just to show a token of our appreciation, we do have custom posters that we made for all of you. And Mr. Gibbs will make sure that yours gets to you.
Thank you.